Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko mangawhau te maunga. Ko waitemata te moana. Ko tamaki makaurau ho. Ko Tanya Wright taku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I've got 2 hours of talking, and I know that this afternoon we've got some additional time for questions and answers, and also some opportunity to talk about case studies. I'm really conscious that in talking about the early years that there are many, many people that hold expertise in this area, and that mine is really only restricted to infant mental health. There's a huge amount of knowledge, I imagine, in the audience, and so I really wondered whether it would be possible just to start with a bit of show of hands as to, given time, we won't ask for everybody who they are, but I'm kind of curious, do people work in early childhood? Education? Midwifery? General practice? Any psychologists? Other disciplines? Great. So, okay. So welcome everybody. This is a difficult talk to give, the early years talk, because of the immense amount of different knowledge that people hold. But I'm going to make some assumptions about your level of knowledge, and if you find that I'm going completely off track, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. I'm really happy about that. The other thing I should say is that the early years has been, in psychoanalytic thought and in psychological thinking, has been recognised as important since the turn of last century. But it's really only been in the last 25 years that we've seen an enormous explosion of interest. And I think that's been brought about by the diversity of the theoretical frameworks which have been brought to play. So neurobiology, developmental psychology, attachment theory. And a key change in my field is a recognition that infants are not unaware or passive, that they're agents in their own change. So today, what I would like to talk about. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the early years focus and why we would intervene early. And I'd like to talk a little bit about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. They're a format for data collection and intervention, which I think is beginning to be spread through a great deal of different fields. Certainly in mental health they're important, but they're important across health, and we're seeing them across use across child services quite widely internationally. And then I want to talk a little bit about 2 specific disorders and the longitudinal outcomes from childhood presentations. And the second part of my talk, after morning tea, I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment theory and give you an update of kind of where we're at attachment theory-wise. Given that it was developed in the 1950s, it's time for us to be evolving that and moving on. And I want to talk a little bit about, in that regard, about reflective functioning and also what we can do as practitioners to enhance our reflective practice. So infant mental health. It's an interdisciplinary field of research and clinical practice which is rapidly expanding and changing. At its core is the recognition that infancy is a foundational developmental period, physically, but also psychologically and socially. It's during that time of infant development that the context of caregiving relationships are at their most important. And caregiving relationships are intergenerational, which will be the foundation of my next talk, but they're also contextual, which is the basis of this talk, as well as being infant-specific. As I've said, there's many stakeholders in the field of early childhood health, which is what leads us to what we call the widely cited "it takes a village to raise a child" notion. There are many, many soil factors, and soil factors I would like to consider as the social and emotional world. And part of this is our values. So that means valuing children, recognising that children are our future and their care central to our society. It includes some recent changes to law, such as promoting safety and valuing parents and caregivers' wellbeing, such as extending parental leave and providing financial support. And I think in this regard, the recent 10-day leave provision to help people extract themselves from family violence is relevant. It includes providing healthy start to life through individual choice and control in pregnancy, birth practices, breastfeeding, minimising the effects of child poverty, But all of that is still not enough. We need to extend this thinking to health and to mental health in particular. The importance. Caregiving relationships are taking a bit of a back seat in our adult-focused lives. We like to think that our children are fine and flourishing, that they really need healthy people themselves. This seed versus soil concept isn't a new one, but it's a way that we're seeing change in all of health, and it might help to explain it by discussing how it's seen in cardiac medicine. So while we still have coronary bypasses, there's a lot more emphasis and population health knowledge on addressing diet, particularly childhood obesity, managing people's blood pressure, encouraging people to exercise right throughout the lifespan. They're the emphases. We can make similar analogies in oncology and most branches of medicine. So why not mental health? In mental health, the early years emphasis has got the potential to improve outcomes right across the lifespan and the generations. So starting with soil. Early experiences matter. And I'd like to introduce you to the concept of ACEs. Do people know about adverse childhood events? A few people? So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, I would consider, and many would agree, was the largest and most important public health study of this century. It began in an obesity clinic in San Diego. In the obesity clinic, in helping people lose weight, there was over a 50% dropout, and that led Dr. Folletti in 1985 to begin talking to people and talking to them about why they were dropping out. And then he broadened that and he started to ask them more broadly about their lives. And what he started to notice is that many people who had dropped out of the study had had really a lot of early life experiences which were adversive. Most commonly, he started to notice the high rates of sexual and physical abuse. But he carried on, and over 17,000 people in the first study were interviewed, and that's because it was taken up by the Centre for Disease Control and also by a Kaiser Permanente, which is an extremely large health insurer in the United States. But what they managed to prove is that the early life experiences influenced poor mental and physical health outcomes right across the lifespan. There is a huge amount of research going on in this field across multiple different countries. Unfortunately, there's none being held in New Zealand, so I can't provide New Zealand data on this. But really what research in the field recognises is the place to intervene in health is the prevention of serious childhood trauma, and to stop directing our treatments at the consequences of that trauma. The most clear example of that is with the example of drug use. So drugs are a biochemical way to manage fear, anger, and depression. And this is a normal response to managing trauma. And once we stop directing our efforts at stopping people using drugs, we can start directing our efforts at mitigating trauma, which is well known now through a set of longitudinal studies across the last 25 years to be more effective. So what are these ACEs? So ACEs, they are adverse childhood experiences. There are 5 that relate directly to abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. I suspect they continue to be underreported in these studies. And 5 relate to what they call household dysfunction, but really I prefer to call family life. Having a family member with a mental illness, sorry this has come out so poorly, incarceration or criminality in the family home, substance abuse, parental divorce, and family violence. One of the important things to know is that ACEs are common. Only 36% of people don't have one, which means that 64% of adults have at least one. So this is American data and American data numbers, and very similar to the Australian data, the German data, the British data. Essentially, approximately a third of the population experience physical abuse. Parents with substance abuse problems. As I said, neglect's possibly a little bit underreported. I'd say that emotional neglect as well as psychological abuse are possibly much more common when we break this down different ways. But as you can see, these are common experiences. There's also an absolutely linear link between the childhood traumas and the number of ACEs that you experience in childhood and your adverse outcomes. There's a linear relationship between the number of ACEs you experience and your life expectancy. And it doesn't matter which ACEs. So I'm sorry about this slide. It's a bit of a poor slide. I started to collect the data and put it together on one side and it just got too busy. Basically, people who've got over 4 ACEs in comparison to people with no ACEs have very serious physical and mental health outcomes. They're more likely to be violent, to be commit violent crimes, to smoke, have sexual risk-taking, particularly in pregnancy, have broken marriages, break more bones, use more drugs, use more drug prescriptions, have more depression. They die younger from suicide, alcoholism and street drug use. They have twice the rates of hepatitis, sexually transmitted disease, chronic respiratory illnesses, and the list just goes on and on. So as I said, it doesn't matter which of the 4 ACEs that you have, the harmful consequences are the same. And that's because the brain can't distinguish from one toxic stress to another. They all have some similarities in their impact. They have differences too, but in terms of these outcomes, they're the same. Now, I'm not sure I can get this. I'm sorry to say that this video isn't going to work, but this is a video which has come from the Developing Child Harvard website, which is a resource which I would recommend that people have a look at. So that again was the Developing Child Harvard educational website. And really what this video shows is the way that our bodies experience trauma and the way that the toxic stress influences the cortisol in our body and how that cortisol goes on to physically damage every organ of our body and including the brain. I just also want to make the point that toxic stress mechanisms also affect our DNA function, which leads to epigenetic consequences, and they're passed on from generation to generation. And they're considered to be the biological mechanism which helps us better understand the impact of historical and generational trauma. I don't think having a biological mechanism makes it any less real, but it shows that it really holds in your body. So here's a huge topic. Sorry.
You may say later, but what ages are you approximately looking at? And is there an age which is more likely to have these future problems than others?
Sure. So there are screening questions for ACEs, which have been developed by the World Health Organization, and they say childhood, which is conventionally understood as under 12. There's also really good evidence that the younger your body experiences the toxic stress, that the more damaging it is, particularly to your neurodevelopment, because the brain's flourishing so much in the 0 to 3 years. I certainly know that's the case for the abuse statistics, and certainly the case for experiencing parental drug use and maternal mental illness, family violence. Don't know about criminality, but maybe they have slightly different times. James might know the answer to that.
Yes, all of those.
Thank you. So here's a huge topic. One slide, addressing child abuse. Probably all know that New Zealand has got some of the worst statistics of child abuse in the developing world. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts that they'd like to share as to why this is. I'd like to suggest that the solutions are found in our values, and that the role of caregiving in society is one of those most important values. And it's the diathesis between community values versus power values, which is changing the demographics of our socioeconomic demographics in New Zealand. I think we've got some really irresponsible media reporting. The tactic of scaring people straight is considered to be a very ineffective strategy, and the ugly portrayals that we see of child abuse in the media and those which hits the court really don't help. They polarise people's views. They make it harder for people to seek the help that they may need. But we do have laws against smacking, which have resulted in a proven effective reduction, and we should be proud of that, because I believe only Norway has something similar. I'd like to also put in a plug here for home visiting and wraparound services, whānau ora and Family Start. We've started down this road of providing effective evidence-based home visiting services. I'd like to also suggest that in this field that we really need to think a little bit more about developing some culturally informed homegrown services. And same for parenting practices. Parenting programs are enormously effective and highly evidenced. They're also deeply controversial in the field of infant mental health. Parenting is something that people do with their hearts much more than their heads, and providing knowledge for people is only one part. So parenting programs are not a panacea, and for many people, these universal programs which have been developed are simply not adequate. I'd really like to say that we really need to be thinking a little bit more about providing services which are trauma-informed. We have a number of highly evidenced therapies which address the sequelae of trauma, EMDR and trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy. They're available in only the large centres of New Zealand. But really, in terms of providing trauma-informed services, this is something that everybody can do and should do. And it's really about how we speak to people. It's about recognition of what a trauma response looks like in a medicalised setting. It's in the language that we use, and I think it's particularly important at births and medical procedures, and as part of the really clear consenting. Topic requires a bit more time, but I'm going to move on to talking about parental mental illness, something I am really passionate about. I'd really like to start by saying that many people that have mental illnesses are absolutely good parents, that this is simply considered a risk factor, and one of the reasons to emphasise it is that this is a remedial risk. Parental mental illness is treatable. So parental mental illness is considered, so mental illnesses in adults are high prevalence illnesses, present in about 15 to 20%, depending on quite where you put your cut-off. And the only data that we really have on this comes from the UK. So 50% of women receiving mental health treatment have children in their care. And in Australia, 1 in 5 households has an adult in it with mental illness. Why we don't know how many parents we have in our current mental health services, how many adults in our mental health services are parents, we still don't know that. Why we don't, I really can't explain. One of the most important findings, and a recent finding which has come from Canada, it looks at both the aggregated difficulties which come with parental mental illness, but also comes from a longitudinal rolling recruitment design from RASIC, in which it's been demonstrated that 1 in 3 offspring of parents with serious mental illnesses develop a mood or psychotic disorder by early adulthood. 1 in 3.
Excuse me, do you think that's seed or soil?
Couldn't tell you the answer to that. So I go on a little bit more to talk a little bit about depression and psychosis. So there are some genetics which sit behind that, which I guess says it's seed and sits in the child, but the caregiving experience that these children have from a very, very early age leads to changes in the infants, and those early changes beget further changes. So I guess the answer is it's relational. Just down here I've got this is a slide that comes from the UK again. They have had a huge cost-effectiveness evaluation to look at the cost-effectiveness of treating maternal mental illness, and in the UK this led to a massive expansion of their services, particularly mother-baby units. So they were able to demonstrate that when a woman has a serious mental illness, that the the costs of it are only borne 28% by the mother, and 72% of the costs are borne by the child. And that's in terms of, as we'll go on to talk about, the serious impact these disorders have. So apologies, this is a busy slide. I'd like to look at each point sort of individually. So we say that maternal depression is important and that it's present in about 15% of people postnatally. So that's saying people with depression, not postnatal distress. It's a highly comorbid disorder with anxiety. We've got a number of studies, not from New Zealand, but paternal depression is also significant, and people talk about it being a second hit. Women with depression often have partners with depression, and it appears that first the woman develops depression and then the partner develops it subsequently, and that's if their marriages hold. So there are many, many longitudinal studies which evidence this, and there's a really good review of this, Stein et al. In 2014, a good systematic review. But essentially, antenatal depression is demonstrated to cause childhood emotional problems, depression and suicide in adolescents. And again, antenatal anxiety is more strongly proven to result in the externalising disorders, including ADHD, but it also has a big impact on cognitive outcomes. The small effect sizes are small, but the cognitive outcomes hold. So they say that the children are leaving school 1 year earlier and 1 year less qualified. Again, UK data. So really, the time to treat major depression is antenatally. But postnatal depression also has a significant impact, causing emotional difficulties in toddlers, particularly problems with emotional dysregulation. The toddlers are less socially skilled and have higher rates of behavioural problems. And this is one of the reasons why people are presenting to treat and wanting treatment at around the age of 18 months, is that it's at that point in time that the externalising disorders become prevalent and where people start to seek help. I'm going to go on to talk a little bit more about internalising disorders and noticing infants' internal experiences. So how is this risk conferred? It's not quite seed or soil. It's because of an early relationship disruption. So as you heard, until recently I've been working in Auckland's Mother and Baby Unit. It might surprise you to hear, but this is a really quiet unit. It's not much noise from babies crying, despite the fact that their relational needs are not being met adequately. There are some infants in that setting which are quiet and under-responsive and avoid eye contact and are shutting down, and there's some infants who are extremely hungry to engage and thriving and trying to build relationship. The negative affect from maternal depression is demonstrable as infant gaze aversion by 6 weeks. It quite quickly leads to less vocalisation and less responsiveness to the environment, which means other people. And this very early relational disturbance has a huge impact on the maternal sense of competence and the maternal bond. So you can see how this small beginning begets a further problems downstream. Women with depression almost unanimously think that they're poor parents anyway, and are often very sensitive to seeing that their infant's less responsive to them than to other people. It leads to poorer caregiving practices. There is a drop-off of breastfeeding. Their practices are less safe, there's less play, and they become more physically punishing. And in line with the patterns in which we see in infants, we see similar patterns of parents. Some are quiet and withdrawn, and some are intrusive, and some are physically rough. I've put a note at the bottom that there are epigenetic and genetic contributions. It's a really interesting field and a talk in itself. Michael Meaney's licking and grooming rats are probably one of the best demonstrations in animal models, but the Dunedin longitudinal study was one of the studies which gave the world a whole lot of information about the impact of early maternal depression on the serotonergic epigenetics of infants. Maternal psychotic illnesses. The risk of having an acute psychosis increases 25-fold after childbirth. So although it's still a relatively rare experience, it's an incredibly important one. And so the acute psychoses are somewhat different from the chronic psychoses. And women with schizophrenia who are childbearing, particularly women with chronic illnesses, they have a heavy burden of stigma and very high rates of custody loss. There's also many confounding factors. They're disadvantaged in their pregnancies. They've got lower rates of partners, more smoking, less antenatal care, and high rates of obstetric complications. They also have smaller babies. So in utero, these babies are disadvantaged. And then if you look at them at a very early age, between 4 and 6 weeks, they also have less gaze, less eye contact, less vocalisation, less positive affect, which means they're less smiley and less responsive. They receive less sensitive interactions. They cue their own mothers less, which results in less positive social interactions and considerably higher rates of anxious and disorganised attachment. These children go on to display cognitive, motor and cognitive delays and early problems, particularly in preschool. They have attentional difficulties and they make a poor social adjustment themselves at school. There's quite significant care deficits, which I'd like to make the point are equally remedial as they are in depression. So we know much less about the maternal psychotic illnesses. And one reason for that is the distrust and avoidance of services. And I think these women have good reason to be distrustful and avoidant. At the moment, we're not providing much in the way of meaningful services for them. I think that women with mental illnesses want to have help. Pregnancy and parenting is an enormous transitional time in people's lives. Not only are they changing and their relationship changing, it's part of our natural life cycle to want things to be better for our children than they were for us. And by meeting that need for somebody, many of the things that have gone wrong in somebody else's own life are made better. And I think that's a universal experience. Okay, one more of my terrible slides. I guess I want to make the point we could be doing much more, and I'm not going to go on to talk about significantly about alcohol and drug use, although I would like to say that the most effective alcohol and drug program in the world is one which doesn't actually address substance abuse. It enriches the person's parenting experience, and through that, they're becoming a better parent, their substance use drops off. There's lots of studies on this from the United States, a woman called Nancy Suchman's work. But in terms of criminality, divorce and family violence, there's a lot going on in these fields. But resilience is really where the focus is being put at the primary level. And there's a really beautiful resource that comes from Beyond Blue, it's Australian, called Building Resilience in Children, aged 0 to 12. There's a real focus on building emotionally supportive soil, relationships, and also where there's been deficits to build skills and a child's sense of self.